On the night of January 31st, 1891, a 19-year-old woman named Helen Potts lay in her dormitory bed at the Comstock School on West 40th Street in Manhattan, telling her roommates about wonderful dreams. She had dreamed of him again, the medical student she'd been seeing. The dreams were beautiful, she said, vivid and sweet. Her roommates had returned from a concert to find Helen in an unusually talkative mood, despite the headache that had kept her home. She'd taken one of the capsules he'd prescribed, just one, as instructed. Within minutes, she'd drifted into sleep, and then into those dreams she described with such warmth. But something was changing. The gas light flickered in the Victorian dormitory as Helen's breathing grew labored. Her words came slower. A numbness crept through her limbs. Her roommates watched as the paralysis spread, as Helen struggled to move, to speak, to draw a breath. They summoned help immediately. 3 doctors arrived through the winter night. They tried everything medical science offered in 1891. Whiskey to stimulate her heart, caffeine to wake her system, atropine to counteract potential poisons, digitalis for her failing pulse. They applied electric shock. They attempted artificial respiration. They fought for hours as Helen slipped further away. Nothing worked. Before dawn, Helen Potts was dead. One of the doctors, a man named Fowler, examined her eyes in the gaslight. Her pupils were almost completely constricted, pinpoints in the light. It was, he knew, a telltale sign. But of what, exactly? And how had a simple headache remedy, prescribed by a trusted medical student, killed a healthy young woman in the space of a single night? The capsule box sat empty on her bedside table, signed with 3 initials, C-W-H. Dr. Fowler searched Helen's room as dawn broke over Manhattan. The empty prescription box offered the only clue: instructions to take 1 capsule before retiring, signed by someone identified only as C-W-H, student. The young women of the Comstock School knew exactly who that was. Carlisle W. Harris, they told Dr. Fowler, a medical student at Columbia, Helen's boyfriend, or something like that. They'd been seeing each other. Harris was summoned in the middle of the night. When he arrived and saw Helen's body, his first words were not of grief or shock at her death, but something else entirely. My God, what can they do to me? Dr. Fowler studied the young man carefully. Harris explained that he had prescribed the capsules for Helen's headaches, a standard preparation, he said. 1/6 grain of morphine combined with quinine in each capsule, a modest dose by any measure. He'd given Helen only 4 of the 6 capsules he'd obtained, he explained, specifically to reduce any risk of overdose. The remaining 2 capsules, still in Harris's possession, were tested. They contained exactly what he claimed, 1/6 of a grain of morphine each, a dose that should have relieved pain, not caused death. Dr. Fowler looked at the results, then back at Harris. According to medical understanding of the time, no one died from 1/6 of a grain of morphine. Yet Helen Potts had taken 1 capsule and was dead within hours. The remaining capsules proved nothing. They were normal. If Harris had poisoned Helen, he had constructed what appeared to be a perfect crime. The evidence of his innocence literally in his pocket. But that question lingered in the January air. Why had his first instinct been to ask what they could do to him? When Helen's mother, Mrs. Potts, arrived from New Jersey, she brought with her a story meant to close the case. Helen had suffered from heart problems, she insisted. The girl's heart had always been weak. There would be no autopsy. Mrs. Potts was firm on this point. She had her daughter's body taken back to New Jersey for immediate burial. The New York authorities, however, were not convinced. Something about the case felt unfinished. They obtained a warrant and waited. 55 days after Helen Potts was laid to rest, Her coffin was raised from the New Jersey earth for exhumation. Mrs. Potts stood watching, knowing what would be revealed. The autopsy told a very different story than the grieving mother had claimed. Helen's heart was perfectly healthy. There had been nothing wrong with it at all. Her brain, however, showed clear signs of congestion, the classic presentation of opiate poisoning. Chemical analysis confirmed significant morphine in her system, but there was something else, something more damning. There was no quinine in Helen's body. None whatsoever. Carlisle Harris had claimed to prescribe morphine and quinine together, yet only morphine was found. Why would a medical student eliminate the quinine from a headache remedy? What possible medical purpose could that serve? As the weight of these findings settled over the investigation, Mrs. Potts finally revealed what she had been protecting, more carefully than the truth about her daughter's heart. Helen and Carlisle Harris had been secretly married for nearly a year. The case had just transformed from a mysterious death into something far darker. In the summer of 1889, Helen Potts, then 18 years old, met Carlisle Harris at the New Jersey resort town of Ocean Grove. He was finishing his first year of medical school. She was young, privileged, and by all accounts, beautiful. A romance developed quickly, too quickly for Mrs. Potts's comfort. When Carlisle approached her about an engagement, she forbade it. Helen was too young, she insisted. The courtship would have to wait. But on February 7th, 1890, Helen told her mother she was going with Carlisle and his brother to see the stock market in New York City. An educational excursion, perfectly chaperoned. Mrs. Potts gave her blessing. The brother never appeared. Instead, Helen and Carlisle went to City Hall, where an alderman performed a marriage ceremony. They signed the register with false names, Helen Nielsen and Charles Harris, close enough to their real names to remember, but different enough to conceal. The marriage was kept completely secret. Helen returned to the Comstock School. Carlisle continued his medical studies at Columbia. They told no one, not friends, not family, not even most of their close acquaintances. It was, by Victorian standards, a scandalous arrangement. But it was also, in Helen's mind, a real marriage. She believed herself to be Mrs. Carlisle Harris, even if the world didn't know it yet. The false names should have been a warning. But Helen was 19 and in love, and Carlisle was charming, educated, and from a respectable family. Why would a man marry in secret and under false names if his intentions were honorable? The answer to that question would only become clear much later. Within 6 weeks of the secret marriage, Carlisle Harris's visits to Helen became less frequent. Helen grew distressed. Mrs. Potts, who knew nothing of the marriage, was pleased to see the relationship cooling. Helen, however, was heartbroken. Then Helen discovered she was pregnant. When she told Carlisle, he didn't celebrate the news or suggest they make their marriage public. Instead, he performed an abortion on his wife himself, a procedure he botched badly. The fetus was killed, but not removed. Helen grew weak and pale. Eventually, her uncle, Dr. Treverton in Scranton, had to perform a second operation to save her life. The picture that emerged later, from testimony at trial, painted a portrait of a young man with a pattern. Harris admitted to a friend, while drunk, that he'd had multiple brides before Helen. His method was straightforward: seduce young women with ginger ale laced with whiskey, or marry them under false names just to get them into bed, then abandon them once the conquest was complete. By late 1890, Mrs. Potts had discovered the marriage. She was furious but practical. She gave Harris an ultimatum: There would be a proper public church wedding by February 7th, 1891, exactly 1 year after the secret ceremony, or she would expose everything. Harris's response was contained in a letter. "All your wishes shall be complied with, provided no other way can be found." No other way. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. What other way could there be to avoid a church wedding besides actually having one? Mrs. Potts apparently didn't grasp what Harris might mean, or perhaps she didn't want to imagine it. 3 weeks before the anniversary deadline, Helen Potts took one of Carlisle's capsules and died in her dormitory room, her pupils constricted to pinpoints, dreaming of him until she couldn't breathe anymore. The prosecution would later theorize about the sophistication of Harris's plot, if indeed it was a plot. The method demonstrated a working knowledge of both medicine and misdirection. Harris had obtained 6 capsules from a pharmacy. He gave Helen only 4 of them. Of those 4, prosecutors believed, 1 contained a massive dose of morphine, perhaps as much as 5 grains instead of 1/6. It didn't matter which capsule contained the lethal dose. If Helen died on the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd capsule, the remaining capsules in her possession would test normal. If she died on the 4th and final capsule, the 2 he'd kept would still show the proper dose. A kind of Russian roulette with pills. The evidence presented at trial revealed an opportunity. 10 days after Helen's death, Harris's medical school class studied the effects of morphine. A large bottle of morphine was shown to the students. Access was unsupervised. It would have been simple for a medical student to obtain a significant quantity without notice. But the most damning evidence came from the chemical analysis. Morphine was found in Helen's body, substantial amounts of it. But there was no quinine. Harris had claimed he prescribed both morphine for pain and quinine for malaria prevention. Yet the quinine was simply absent. Had he deliberately left it out? And if so, why? In 1891, forensic toxicology was still in its infancy, but the doctors understood one crucial fact. If Harris had actually intended to treat Helen's headaches, the quinine would be there. Its absence suggested the capsules were never meant to heal anything at all. The genius of the scheme, if it was a scheme, lay in its undetectability. Even after chemical analysis, even after exhumation, the prosecution could never prove which specific capsule had killed Helen. They could only prove that one of them had, and that Carlisle Harris had been the one to prescribe them, prepare them, and deliver them to his secret wife just weeks before her mother's wedding deadline. After the autopsy results came back, Assistant District Attorney Vernon Davis reviewed the evidence. What he found was a mess. The coroner's office had bungled nearly every aspect of the initial investigation. The pillbox had been lost. There had been no immediate autopsy. The capsule analysis had been fumbled. Testimony transcripts had disappeared. And the police showed no interest in pursuing the case. Davis made a decision. He would not prosecute. The evidence, while suggestive, was too compromised. Carlisle Harris, it seemed, would walk away free. But on March 21, 1891, the New York Evening World published what it called a world-startling article. The reporters had dug up affidavits from Mrs. Potts and Dr. Treverton. They laid out the secret marriage, the botched abortion, the suspicious death. The story caught fire. Public outrage forced the authorities to reopen the case. The world would later boast about bringing a criminal to justice when the police had failed. There was some truth to this, though the newspaper inflated its own role. Dr. Peabody, Dean of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, had already concluded that Harris was morally unfit to be a doctor, regardless of whether he was legally guilty of murder. But the media attention was undeniable. Without the world's intervention, without the pressure of public scrutiny, Carlisle Harris might well have continued his medical career, the death of his secret wife dismissed as a tragic accident. The question remained, how much power should newspapers have in determining which cases receive justice? Was this legitimate investigation or trial by press? In 1891, the answer seemed clear enough. The public demanded answers, and the authorities, shamed by the coverage, finally moved forward with prosecution. On January 14, 1892, almost exactly 1 year after Helen's death, the trial of Carlisle Harris began. Charles E. Sims, Jr. led the prosecution. The defense was headed by William F. Howe, a prominent attorney known for defending difficult cases. Remarkably, Harris himself handled much of his own examination. It was either remarkable confidence or remarkable arrogance. The defense strategy focused on a single possibility. Some people, they argued, were extraordinarily susceptible to morphine. Perhaps Helen was one of them. Perhaps she could die from 1/6 of a grain, a dose that would merely relieve pain in most people. The prosecution's counter was elegant. Helen had taken her first capsule with no ill effects whatsoever. She'd reported wonderful dreams, easy sleep. This proved she wasn't abnormally susceptible to morphine. If she had been, that first capsule would have shown some reaction. Instead, she'd slept peacefully. Only the final capsule she took, whichever number it was in the sequence of 4, had killed her. The witnesses told the story piece by piece. Dr. Rudolph Whithouse testified about the chemical analysis. Dr. Fowler described finding Helen's constricted pupils and the desperate attempts to save her. Dr. Treverton spoke of the botched abortion. The affidavits detailed the pattern of deception, the false names, the secret marriage, the multiple brides. And then there was the missing quinine. Why had Harris prescribed both morphine and quinine, but only morphine appeared in Helen's body? On February 8, 1892, exactly 2 years to the day after Carlisle Harris secretly married Helen Potts under false names, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Harris was sentenced to death. Appeals were filed and denied. The date was set, May 8, 1893. Execution at Sing Sing Prison. More than 1,000 people gathered on the hillside outside the prison that morning, waiting to see the black flag raised, the signal that the execution had been carried out. Capital punishment was still a public spectacle, even if the actual execution happened behind prison walls. Harris issued a final statement before he was led to the electric chair. He admitted his life had been immoral. He hoped to serve as a warning to other young men about the consequences of dissolute living. But then he added something else. I have no further motive for any concealment whatever. I desire to state that I die absolutely innocent of the crime of which I have been convicted. His mother, Frances Macready Harris, refused to accept the verdict. She placed a newspaper advertisement declaring that her son had been judicially murdered on May 8, 1893. She arranged for his tombstone to bear an inscription that remains to this day: murdered by 12 men / if the jury had only known. But known what exactly? What evidence did Mrs. Harris believe had been overlooked or suppressed? She never specified. She went to her grave believing her son innocent, insisting that justice had failed. We're left with an uncomfortable question. Was Carlisle Harris a calculating killer who maintained his lie even at the moment of death? Or was he an innocent man, convicted on circumstantial evidence and executed for a crime he didn't commit? The evidence suggested one answer. His mother's conviction suggested another. And between those two positions lies the uncertainty that makes this case linger in memory more than a century later. Helen Potts was 19 years old when she died. She was described by those who knew her as beautiful, kind, gentle. She came from wealth and privilege, the kind that should have protected her. But in 1891 New York, a young woman's virtue was more valuable than her life. Mrs. Potts found herself caught between grief and scandal. She lied about her daughter's heart disease, tried to prevent an autopsy, attempted to bury the truth along with her daughter's body. Victorian shame culture demanded it. But eventually she cooperated with the investigation, knowing it would expose everything: the secret marriage, the abortion, the deception. The cost of justice was her family's reputation. Miss Schofield, Helen's friend, was one of only 2 people Helen trusted with the secret of her marriage. She watched as Helen grew desperate, trapped between a husband who wouldn't acknowledge her and a mother who demanded propriety. After Helen's death, Miss Schofield testified, adding another piece to the mosaic of evidence. And then there was Frances McCready Harris, Carlisle's mother. She believed in her son absolutely. She died maintaining his innocence. Her faith in him never wavered, even when presented with evidence of his pattern of seduction and abandonment. Perhaps that's what mothers do: love beyond evidence, beyond reason. But there were other women too. The other brides Harris admitted to. Young women seduced with whiskey and false promises of marriage. We don't know their names. We don't know how many there were. We don't know what happened to them after Harris discarded them. They remain unnamed, unvindicated, lost to history. Helen Potts had a name, a grave, a mother who eventually chose truth over propriety. The others weren't so fortunate. More than a century later, we can lay out what was known and what remains uncertain. The evidence suggesting guilt was substantial. No quinine was found in Helen's body, despite Harris's claim that he'd prescribed it. Morphine was present in lethal quantities. Harris's first response upon seeing his dead wife was to worry about himself. His pattern of behavior, multiple fake marriages, casual seductions, abandonment, was established through witness testimony. The botched abortion demonstrated callousness toward Helen's welfare. His letter to Mrs. Potts mentioned finding another way to avoid the public wedding. He had access to morphine through his medical school classes. The sophisticated method, 4 capsules given, 2 kept back, ensuring that testing would always show normal doses, suggested premeditation. But the case against him was entirely circumstantial. The remaining capsules did test normal. There was no direct proof that he had tampered with any specific capsule. No one saw him do it. His denials were consistent, even at the moment of death. His mother believed him innocent until her final breath. And the investigation had been bungled badly enough that reasonable doubt existed. In 1892, the jury weighed this evidence and concluded that Carlisle Harris had murdered his wife. They believed he had used his medical knowledge to construct a nearly perfect crime, foiled only by the telltale signs of opiate poisoning and the absence of quinine in Helen's system. But we should acknowledge what we'll never know. We don't know which capsule killed Helen, or even if it was the capsules at all, though the medical evidence strongly suggested it. We don't know what Harris was thinking in those final moments before his execution. We don't know what his mother meant by, "if the jury had only known." The evidence speaks, but it speaks in the language of probability, not certainty. The case of Carlisle Harris became one of the early notable executions by electric chair in New York State. The method was still new, still controversial. Harris's death helped establish the procedure that would be used for decades. The case sparked copycat poisoning incidents throughout the 1890s. Medical students, it seemed, had taken the wrong lesson from Harris's trial. Not that murder would be punished, but that it could be made to look accidental. Algernon Blackwood, reporting on the trial for the New York Times, was inspired to write a short story called Max Hensig, Bacteriologist. Bernard Barchet later wrote The Case of the Six Capsules. The case was even recorded on a spoken word album titled 4 American Murder Mysteries. But beyond its cultural echo, the case demonstrates something about the Gilded Age that remains relevant. Medical knowledge could be weaponized. Forensic science was only beginning to catch up with criminal sophistication. The media could force justice when official channels failed. Victorian sexual double standards created predators and trapped their victims in shame. Class and privilege could shield someone from scrutiny. Almost. Today, Helen Potts rests in a cemetery in New Jersey. Carlisle Harris is buried in New York. His tombstone still bears the words his mother had carved there: "Murdered by 12 men." She never accepted the verdict. She never stopped believing in his innocence. Perhaps that's the final legacy of the case. Not guilt or innocence, but the uncomfortable space between certainty and doubt, between evidence and faith, between what we can prove and what we can never fully know. The 6 capsules remain a mystery, even after all these years. We know one of them killed Helen Potts. We're reasonably certain who prepared them. But the absolute truth died with Harris in the electric chair. Or perhaps it died even earlier, in a Victorian dormitory on a winter night, while a young woman dreamed of beautiful things and breathed her last.